Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Marsden Payne. I am a senior manager here at Efficio, and I am delighted to welcome you to this Wednesday webinar. And today we're going to be discussing the upcoming Procurement Act, and in particular, how we as procurement professionals can generate additional value through the new competitive flexible procedure. So if you're on this webinar, you've probably already heard of Efficio or are kind of broadly familiar with us, but in case we are new to you, Efficio are the world's largest independent procurement and supply chain consultancy, and we partner with our clients across the globe to drive transformation in procurement and supply chain to drive additional value for all of those organizations. Now, more recently in our public sector work, where I work, we have been working with contracting authorities to get ready for the procurement reform. And we run events like this to facilitate some really useful and practical conversations about the changes ahead. So we are really keen to make this webinar as interactive as we possibly can. It isn't a lecture, so if you'd like to submit any questions, any comments, thoughts, feelings, whatever, please do use the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. We don't endorse online heckling, so please keep that to yourself. I'll be asking the audience some questions. Sorry, well, rather you'll be asking the questions. I'll be asking the panel your questions throughout the session as they pop up, although we will reserve some time at the end specifically for any questions you might have. So the way the flow will go is about kind of half an hour-ish with some pre-prepared questions that we've got, some questions from yourselves, and then a dedicated section at the end for any additional questions. We are also recording today's webinar if anyone's not available to join in person, although please note that I obviously won't be able to respond to your questions if you're submitting them after this webinar. You can, however, email things across or pop us a message on LinkedIn, and we are happy to respond to any questions that might arise after this session today. Right, I think that's enough from me for now. Let me introduce you to our lovely panel. First up, we have my friend and colleague, Joe Gross, who is one of our public sector practice principals at Efficio. Bringing a legal perspective, we have Kevin Calder, who is a partner at Mills and Reeve LLP. And last but by no means least, we are joined by Darren Naud, who's Chief Executive at DR Naud Limited, who will be bringing his expertise as Head of Procurement in local government. So, guys, I mean, I think it's only fair. Darren, you were introduced last. I'm going to shoot the first question at you, if you don't mind. I think before we get into the specificities of the competitive flexible procedure, it's worth us just having a bit of an overview of kind of what is different from the Procurement Act as we see it coming to the PCR of 2015.
Thanks very much. Quite a lot, actually, quite a lot, all very exciting. So hopefully it'll be on us in the near future. I think from a practitioner's point of view, I think the legislation is a game changer, and I say that because of the competitive flexible procedure. So we'll come on to that in due course. I think the main changes are obviously it's a lot shorter, simplified, and far more flexible. There's less procedures by line item, but it can actually give you more innovation and more flexible with a competitive flexible. There's new objectives, obviously. There's a broader approach to value for money. So meat becomes MAT in terms of the most advantageous tender. And whilst the word economic is removed from the acronym, I don't think for 1 minute procurers will forget about the value for money and cost implications of things, given the set objectives. We've got the National Procurement Policy Statement, which I think is a very clever addition, because that gives the ability to tweak and change government objectives going forward. And I suspect that may happen sometime in the near future, even though it's only just been updated. You've got the benefit of having national objectives, and you can use your own local objectives and priorities. Perhaps the only downside, and I say downside purely because of the onerous nature of it, whilst I'm a big fan of transparency and the sharing of information, it is going to be quite onerous for procurers to manage the whole project life cycle from cradle to grave, if you want, and every step of the way. to communicate what you are going to do and what you have done, etc. Very helpfully, there's increased prioritization towards small, medium enterprises and DCSE organisations with the need to remove barriers wherever possible and consider lots. I've mentioned the competitive flexible procedure, but I do think because of the NPPS, there will be an increased focus towards social value outcomes. So there are some people that say, because the Act doesn't specifically mention social value, that it's lost its way. My view, from a practitioner's point of view, it's absolutely the opposite. Because of the National Procurement Policy Statement, the objectives that have set out, and the new objectives for the Act, social value is at the forefront of things. So delivering good social, economic, and environmental outcomes, I think, will be a great opportunity for people. And I think, to sum up, having been a procurement practitioner in global private sector and in local government, I think you'll get a bit of a best of breed. So you'll have all the benefits of private sector approaches regarding innovation and flexibility and negotiation. But coupled with that, you'll have the rigor and the transparency and the fairness of the public sector. So overall, for me, I think this is a very welcome change when it comes upon us. But I think, as we may get into, I think it might be a bit of a slow burn in terms of people taking big steps to do things significantly different. I think there will be a build-up of confidence and capability and knowledge and sharing before we get the real benefit from it. So that for me is my synopsis. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those things, and it changes very exciting, but it also can be very scary as well. Which is why, yeah, we're doing a lot of focus on kind of things like this to try and kind of encourage people to have a look at what is different, and so we just don't end up repeating the kind of things that we were doing before in the previous procurement regulations. So we've mentioned competitive flexible procedure a couple of times. Joe, could you just give a summary of kind of what that looks like? What is this competitive flexible procedure thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and Darren mentioned a reduced number of procedures. I think I'm gonna step back a little bit more holistically, and we talk about 7 down to 3. It's probably a narrative most people will have heard. It's not quite true when we get into the detail, because actually there's a whole host of wrapping kind of activities that our practitioners need to consider when looking at your route to market. It's worth reminding ourselves, and Darren talked about transparency earlier, there are notifiable below threshold activities. So even though you're below threshold, above 30k is notifiable. So, there's a consideration on how you want to handle that. Although very specific areas, we do still have the light touch regime. We dip into our three key procedures, really: your open procedure, your single stage activities, your competitive flexible, and we'll dive into that a bit more, and your direct award. For many organizations or many particular goods or services, they may be excluded. So we've got an excluded element around that. For those who use them, establishing a dynamic market is a separate kind of type of activity. And then obviously framework or dynamic market call-offs, again, are kind of separate pathways. So although there are 3 competitive procedures, or 3 key procedures, 2 competitive, 1 direct award, depending on the way your organization views what applies, you're really probably actually looking at a bit more of a holistic 8, but that would have been 14 previously. So it is still definitely down. In terms of competitive flexible, I think the regulations are appropriately ambiguous around it in terms of any multi-stage competitive tendering procedure. And actually, I like that looseness of term. The ability to design your own is really good. And that's kind of a key bit around there. And also making them proportional. those of you who are anchored in the previous regs, it is really an amalgamation of the best bits from the restricted negotiated innovation partnership. It's taking all of those elements and adding to them. So I think, hopefully that sets the scene. And then we will kind of explore kind of some of the options and how you can apply them in a bit more detail.
Sounds good. Thanks, Joe. So it sounds like, what I'm taking from that, there's certainly going to be a bit more flexibility than perhaps we've had before, right? But I would imagine there are also some quite clear guide rails, or at least I'd hope there are some quite clear guide rails about what people can and can't do. Kevin, I imagine you spent a lot of time recently poring over the proposed new regulations. Have you got a view on kind of what guide rails are there in the competitive flexible procedure, what people can and can't do?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm afraid, forced to the lawyer to tell you what you can't do. So the competitive flexible procedure, it is easy to see it as a kind of a free-for-all. So you can design your own procedure, do whatever you like. But there are quite a lot of sort of tram lines guiding you around that. So first of all, we've already mentioned that the new Procurement Act's got some principles in which you have to follow. So some of those we're very familiar with, things like equal treatment, also keeping an eye out for SMEs, but also some new ones, things like public benefit and so on. So you've got to take those into account when you're designing your process. You've also got to be transparent in a number of respects. You've got to say what the process is going to be up front, and you've then got to deliver against that process. And notices has already been briefly mentioned. There are lots of notices. Under the old regime, we had up to 4 notices. I think we've got 14 under the new regime. So if you're a contracting authority, you're going to need to publish lots of notices through these processes. You also have various duties. So, as Joe mentioned, I think you've got to follow the National Procurement Policy Statement. You've got to think about lots. You've got to think about pre-market engagement. There's rules about that. You've got the assumption is you want to run some sort of selection phase for suppliers, and there are rules about that. It's now called the participation phase, and there are rules about how you might look at which suppliers are excluded or excludable, and then how you will determine how many suppliers get through and select those suppliers. Then there are rules about award criteria, there are rules about specifications, rules about conflicts of interest, rules, as you'd expect, about minimum time limits. Those are still with us in relation to how long you have to request an expression to effectively express your interest in the process, and also how long you have to tender. So, and there are also rules about the extent to which you can modify the procedure as you work through it. So it absolutely is flexible in terms of there are lots of options, lots of different ways you could do things. You can do things you didn't do before, but it's very important not to see it as a sort of Wild West free-for-all. There are quite a lot of bits of the regulations which you will have to adhere to as you work through the process.
Oh, that's no fun. Where's the Wild West we were all hoping for? I jest, but the point about notices though is actually kind of set the Q&A folder on fire. There's lots of people asking questions about notices. If I could pose some of those to you folks. The first one is probably more appropriate for you, Kevin. So given that there is an increase of notices in the proposed new procedure, would you say that therefore increases the likelihood of exposure to legal challenge?
I think yes is the answer to that. And actually, I mean, the notices, I think is one of the potentially most exciting parts of the new Procurement Act, or scary part, depending on your point of view. So there's a few notices in particular which are brand new and might cause pause for thought from contracting authorities. So one of them is a performance notice, and you're legally obliged, if you have a very poorly performing supplier, to publish a notice and say so. There's also a termination notice where you have to publish that you terminated a contract and why. And there's a transparency notice where you have to explain why you're doing a direct award or variation. Clearly, suppliers are not going to be very happy if you publish that they're a poorly performing supplier, and they'll be even more unhappy when they find out that makes them an excludable supplier, as in they could be excluded from other procurement processes because you as a contracting authority have published this notice. So in terms of the answer question, does it create more legal risk? Yes, because of the content of the notices and the impact of the notices. But also, yes, because suppliers will be able to see when much more clearly when an authority has done something wrong. Because previously, if you got to the end of a contract, you might extend it, you might have terminated it early. There's not necessarily a requirement for a notice. Now there is, because you will either have a termination notice, you'll either have a tender notice for reprocurement, or you'll have a notice about a contract variation. Either way, a notice of some form is going to be published. And if there isn't a notice, the supplier can sort of see that you've done something you shouldn't have. So there's going to be a lot more visibility. And of course, the idea is that all of these notices are collected into a fantastic searchable database, which means that, again, suppliers and other third parties can start to keep an eye across the piece on what contracting authorities doing and also what their competitors are doing. So, as a potentially very exciting or a bit scary, but certainly one to watch out for.
Kevin, sorry, Laura, can I just jump in? Kevin, do you think this is going to heighten the importance of effective contract management and also maybe shift the balance of, I'll say power the word, towards the buyer? Because, you know, I've suffered as a practitioner in past, you know, where you've had a poor performing supplier, you've carried out various reviews to stimulate improvement, it hasn't been realised, you've re-procured, and that poor performing supplier happens to have submitted the best bid and wins again. So do you think that shifts the power a little bit and also, you know, raises the bar about effective contract management?
Yes to both. So under the new Procurement Act, previously the regulations were mainly focused on the procurement bit. So once you'd got your contract done, you know, job done, there's now much more focus on actual contract performance, contract management, contract extension, contract termination. That's all within the scope of the Procurement Act. So it's going to mean that there's a lot more focus on contract management, and it means suppliers will be much more focused on it as well, because, as I say, there's potentially a lot hanging on a performance notice. Because if you're supposing you're a supplier that does a lot of business with the UK public sector, if you really foul up on one contract and there is a performance notice which says this supplier's, you know, had it in breach, poorly performing, had the contract terminated, that potentially makes you an excludable supplier, which then means you could be excluded from all future UK tenders which you bid for. So that's potentially really quite serious for a supplier with a major public sector customer base. So in terms of your question, does it give additional power to contracting authorities? Potentially, yes, because public bodies are obliged to publish these notices. So you can imagine a discussion which is, so supplier, you're not performing very well this month. If it happens again next month, I'm going to have to publish one of these performance notices because I'm obliged to, and it's going to be in the public domain that you're poorly performing. Do you really want that, or are you going to try a bit harder? So I think it is very much a new tool in the public body's arsenal. And it'd be interesting to see how it's used, and whether, I suppose, public bodies are too nervous to use it, or whether it starts to become something that's really interesting in terms of negotiation and contract management, exactly as you say, Darren.
Thank you.
So just to continue with that theme, okay, it sounds as though there will be some element of administrative burden through the increased number of notices. Darren, in kind of if you was kind of sat in some of your previous roles, you're looking at the team that you manage, would you look at kind of flexing the structure, changing the structure of the team to account for some of those kind of changes that are coming, or would you sort of wait and see?
I think the biggest change will be to make sure you manage the administrative burden, because I think there's a lot of positives about the transparency and, you know, as Kevin just talked about in terms of the reporting. I don't think it would change the operational structure from a procurement project delivery point of view, but I think maybe some administrative resource to make sure that each procurement officer is managing the notices effectively and publishing them on time. Because I think people will be looking at that in a lot more detail than perhaps they have in the past. I'll be quite candid. In my career, there are times when I've inverted commas deliberately forgotten to post a particular notice, and nobody really knocked on my door. But I do think, given the transparency of it now, the significant number of notices, we will need to make sure we've got some administration support in the function, for example, to make sure things are delivered. And again, what we don't want this to become is an admin burden that draws away valuable procurement innovation delivery time from clever procurement practitioners. So you may get maybe one or two specialized roles being created for people who make sure that the admin and the notices are done well, and again making sure that you've got systems in place to manage things. And we'll probably come on to it, but I think there will be an increase in the need for record keeping throughout the process. So I'll hold that thought there, because I think we might come on to it later.
No spoilers, please. But that does lead quite nicely onto another question we've had from the audience. Joe, this is possibly one for you. So someone's said, okay, we're looking at how we can implement all of these kind of new rules, new requirements from a workflow perspective. What would your advice be on how best to implement this? So, is a workflow kind of trigger appropriate to use? What happens if you don't have systems in place?
Yeah, I think so. It's a great question, because it is all about the right trigger points and understanding those trigger points. And it kind of comes back to my point earlier around actually we're not really in a world of 3 procedures, we're in a world of 7 or 8 or a number of variations against those for your department, depending on how you want to brand things. So my advice is to kind of break down your activity into rows, and then you can look at each notice and comment on whether it's mandatory, and because then it's relatively easy for a practitioner to look at that and say, actually, I understand the activity I'm doing. I'm doing a framework call off. Therefore, some of the notices are mandatory, some are not, and it gives them like a bespoke guide. There are lots of really helpful process flows available on a whole host of law firms' website. Obviously, Mills and Reeve's ones are the best, but there is a bit of additional work when you start to look at breaking that down by process, and it's something we've started. So it's something I think we're happy to commit to sharing back with this audience. So I think that's the first step. By process, what are your obligations? When do you need to do them? What are your trigger points? There are some new skills that people are going to have to consider. So there is an obligation to publish contracts that will need to be redacted in some part. I think there will be probably less effort in that than we think initially, because a lot of information in contracts is not controversial, not sensitive, obligations, all that kind of thing. So I think that will be a bit lighter touch. I think the final bit is departments will probably need to look at some form of central coordination at the front and the back end. So our pipeline notices, you'll probably want to coordinate centrally. And at the back end, your payment compliance notices, all of those kind of good things, your payment notices, etc. You can probably coordinate back end. So there's probably a bit of roles and responsibilities, who's responsible for what notices, etc. I do think, tying the conversation up though, the obligation to publish 3 KPIs for contracts above 5 million is going to be interesting. And we know a lot of the culture in a lot of areas is that the business managed contracts, you're probably going to have to lean in a little bit to do that. My view on contract management is, as long as you're doing it with a regular drumbeat and setting that expectation consistently, you should be okay. Where you will run into trouble, I think, quite quickly is if you let a contract drift for 6 or 12 months, you're a bit unhappy, you don't really say anything, and then all of a sudden you go, I'm really unhappy, I'm publishing a poor performance notice, and I'm giving you a red KPI in the next review. You know, that's where things will get uncomfortable very, very quickly. So I think, just to close off the contract management bit, you know, consistency and regularity of feedback is key. Let your expectations, let the supplier know you're all in agreement, you're all on the same page, and then it will become a lot easier.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Some really helpful practical advice there. I'd quite like us to, we've got into the detail quite quickly. I'd actually quite like us to just zoom out a second. So the competitive flexible procedure, there will be an element of negotiation in it, one would imagine. That's quite important. But I found that often when we talk about negotiation, people kind of throw in the terms clarification, dialogue. They almost become synonymous. Is there an actual difference, Kevin, from a legal perspective? There must be, surely.
Yes, there is. Although not much of one for practical purposes in the case of negotiation and dialogue. So, I mean, it's a good question. So, negotiation kind of means what you'd expect it to mean under a dictionary definition. So it is having a discussion, typically about a tender you've already received, to try and improve it. So to get better value for money, to get a better technical solution, to get something that works better for you. So typically, negotiation is, I've already got a tender or a proposal in front of me, and I'm trying to negotiate with the relevant supplier to seek some improvements to that. Dialogue can involve negotiation, but is often more about a situation where the public body doesn't quite know what it wants, or can't define in detail what it wants, or what solution might meet its requirements. So a dialogue is a discussion to try and understand what's available in the marketplace from suppliers in order to inform the authority's decision making about what it needs to ask for, what might meet those requirements. But actually, there is a real blurring in practice between that and negotiation, and certainly, as those who've been involved in competitive dialogue procedures will know, absolutely a competitive dialogue procedure would involve negotiation. Clarification has sort of two different meanings, so it depends which direction you're going in. So you'll be very familiar with clarification questions asked of the public body during the sort of tendering process to explain in more detail, you know, what you mean, and that's a very useful process in terms of ironing out any glitches or clarifying the intent of the procurement documents. Once the tender's in, then clarification in the other direction, so the public body asking the supplier for clarification, is generally about, and there are quite strict rules around this, it's about understanding an ambiguity in a tender and getting that clarified. What it is not about is allowing the tenderer to have another go or to supplement their bid. It's about making sure that if something's ambiguous, the public body fully understands it. So hope that helps.
No, absolutely. So does that mean that it's not kind of substantially different to what we see in the existing kind of regulations in terms of kind of the use of clarification?
Yeah, so the rules around when you can clarify and when you can't are going to be broadly the same, subject to what you decide to do and how you document your competitive flexible procedure. So the procedure does anticipate that there will, you know, as you would expect, be a tendering stage, and those tenders will be evaluated. And again, in the interest of it's to do with transparency, that if you said the tenders must be in by the 1st of October, and then you allow someone to substantially amend their bid after that date, that's unequal treatment / lack of transparency. Whereas if you clarify a tender, that's potentially acceptable. And certainly good practice is to be very clear in the documentation you issue about, you know, we may clarify, and here's what we consider to be a clarification for those purposes.
Great, thank you. Just a quick one for you, Darren. So based on kind of what you've seen so far, the comparisons between the two, do you think there'll be a kind of an impact to the length of time procurements take to run under the competitive flexible versus kind of an equivalent procedure in the existing regulations?
In terms of the the technical aspect of the procurement in terms of tendering and you know, contract award, the timescales will be similar. But I think what you will see is far more preliminary market engagement, pre-procurement engagement. Now, as a practitioner, I've always encouraged that, but I know certain public procurers have been nervous about that pre-procurement engagement. From my point of view, you know, it's always been a positive thing to do. The rules currently don't say that you can, but they also don't say that you can't. So it's up to, you know, individual choice. The new act actively encourages preliminary market engagement. So that's beneficial both sides, both buy side and supply side, in terms of making sure you can get the right solution, understanding the needs of the project, even the opportunity for the supplier to influence the process or even the award criteria, etc., that things go through. So I think at the front end, you will see more visible activity, which from a perception point of view could look like things are longer. I mean, there's always, having worked both sides in terms of private and public, the private sector view is, public sector procurements take far too long. Well, actually, they don't. The only difference between private and public, from my point of view, is the visibility. So when I was in the global private sector, I did a lot of preliminary market engagement, but I didn't tell anybody. Nobody knew about it, and they only actually saw the visible bit when, you know, tenders gone out and come back in. So I think you will get more visibility there of the preliminary market engagement, and I think also you'll get more stages. So those people who are used to just the open procedure or just the straight restricted, you know, a simple participation phase and invitation to tender phase, you will get more phases of steps in the process to carry out certain activities. And for me, one of the interesting things that will come into play is something that, you know, being candid, I've always encouraged my procurement teams when I was in the public sector to do, but we didn't shout about it, is like the preferred supplier stage. So, for example, in the restricted procedure currently, you're not allowed to negotiate. However, you know, my advice always to the teams that I've managed is, once you have a clear winner objectively and you've got the optimum tender, and you're not going to change the outcome of that, you should always have a dialogue or a communication to try and optimize the outcome, even in a restricted procedure. Now, lawyers will probably tell you that's offside. But actually, from my perspective, I never got challenged on it, because the only person that could be grumpy is the winning bidder, because you're making the requirements a little bit harder. So I do think there'll be a lot of dialogue at the preferred supplier stage before you do the contract award, particularly probably to fine-tune some of the key performance indicators that you're going to have to measure and report on. You know, and as a passionate person, having led social value nationally in the past, I think that's a great opportunity to really hone in on what are the possible social value outcomes that you could get out of the project that more appropriately meet local needs or community needs, etc. So I think back end and front end, you'll probably get an elongation that's a lot more visible than it's been in the past. But for me, that's a good thing. And I think the other thing that we haven't really touched on, which I think is a real positive, and I think any practitioners on the call will probably endorse, is the pipeline notice. Because I'm sure it doesn't happen in anybody's organisation on this call, but sometimes I've experienced somebody knocking on my door saying, I want this tender to go out in 2 weeks' time, because we've only just identified the requirement or we've forgotten about it. So that pipeline notice now, that should get published, I think, every April, ideally up to 18 months, will put the onus back on the service areas to early engage with procurement and legal colleagues to plan the procurement. So that will give you more time to do the preliminary market engagement and do things more effectively. So that's one notice I'm a big fan of. I'm not so keen on all of them, but that one is definitely probably top of my list.
That is good to hear. Sorry, Joe, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I always find there's a bit of a myth in public procurement that
There are many myths.
there are many myths. There's one myth I'd like to bust right now, which is that the statutory timelines drive the procurement, because, you know, there are a whole host of timelines around, you know, how long do you need to leave your tender out for a supplier to respond? And very, very rarely is that the long pole in the tent. You know, normally the supplier needs longer than that to give you a credible response anyway. So anyone who is planning a procurement based on the minimum statutory templates is either doing something really, really simple, in which case I do have a bit of sympathy for you. But you're probably actually being over ambitious, and the supplier's going to need to come back. You know, the only ones that are truly delays are your standstill periods, because no one's doing anything there anyway. You know, I think one of the big differences really in timeline is probably internal governance, if we're all honest about it. I think 30% of procurement timelines is internal governance, external governance, parent organizations, etc., etc. So, you know, if you really want to challenge timelines, you can be a little bit smarter in your procurement. Absolutely do your early market engagement, but, you know, being slick around your internal governance as well will probably actually make the biggest impact on everything.
Absolutely agree with that, Joe. I think, you know, having worked both sides, the biggest frustration for me is getting to yes that we're going to procure. And that probably public sector side does take longer in terms of, you know, particularly if you're in a political environment, maybe less so in health. But if you're in a local government political environment, getting approval to proceed on a project and making sure the funding is available at the right time, etc., that's genuinely where things take longer. And maybe that's where the myth is that public sector procurement takes longer. Planning for it probably takes longer. Getting to yes to procure takes longer, but the procurement process itself shouldn't.
Yeah, that actually leads quite neatly onto a kind of follow-up question I had for you folks. So we know that we as procurement cannot work in silos. And you've already told the tale, Darren, of the customer that comes knocking on your door expecting a tender to go out tomorrow. So that lends itself to the point, which is, you know, we can't do this on our own. The change is going to be new for us. It's also going to be new for our legal stakeholders, our technical customer stakeholders, potentially even our finance stakeholders. If we take some of these groups, so actually I'll start with you, Kevin, if you don't mind. Do you have any kind of advice or guidance on how best procurement practitioners can engage with their legal teams about the upcoming changes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I suppose the fact that the interesting thing about the new regime, as I mentioned earlier, is the scope of it. So the old regime was about procurement; it was about selecting a supplier. The new regime is about selecting a supplier and so much more. It's about the early market engagement, as Darren was just mentioning. It's about the contract management, as we've also discussed. So I think that means that there needs to be conversations between a wider group of people and the legal team and the advisory team, because it's not just the narrow procurement, the buyers that are going to have to engage with this. It's also the contract management function, and actually it's also the finance function. There are notices about prompt payment, etc., and payment notices. So there is a broad range of people that need to be involved. And I think in terms of the legal team, I think getting the legal team involved at an early stage is, you might say, I would say that, but it's a good idea, because, I mean, things like the performance notice we've mentioned, if lawyers are involved early, hopefully you avoid things escalating. If there's an issue in terms of contract management, performance, etc., you want it sorted without the need for a notice, without things escalating. And if you are thinking you might need a notice, then having an early discussion about, what is our justification for a direct award? Is it going to stand up in a notice? Is going to help smooth the path. And I think a quick conversation with legal colleagues potentially can save a lot of time down the track.
Yeah, I can imagine, as much as we don't like kind of being told you need to tender tomorrow, you don't like being told, oh, can you review this in the next 30 minutes because it needs to go out. So early engagement is a good thing.
or worse still, we've done this.
Oh, we've done it.
Is it fine?
Please, sir, can you sign this off?
I'm a big fan of begging for forgiveness, Kevin.
Oh, no.
Proceed at pace until apprehended is what I used to do. So
should I add a caveat in there that this is not Efficio endorsed approach?
Yeah, this is not Efficio endorsed. But to be honest, it's a really important point, right? And this might be a bit controversial. To some non-procurement people, they think procurement is just this little bit where you chuck a load of documents out the door and you get a reply. We need to consider it's a project, and you need a project team, and everybody needs to input into that. And I have to be honest, in my time in local government, I always considered the lawyers as part of my team. We involved them in category boards to plan the procurements, and you could have some early sensible conversations saying, well, you've done that before, you can just replicate certain ideas there. That's low risk. We'll just have a final look at the documents before they go out the door. In other cases, it's, look, we haven't done this before. There's quite a bit of complexity here. We need some specialized standard terms and conditions for it. Let's have a much more in-depth conversation. And to be honest, that's really easy to say, but it's actually difficult to do in practice. But it's just common sense. And I do think, particularly nervous procurement officers in the new regime, I think probably for the first 6 months, procurers and lawyers will be living together. I think the lawyers will be openly, warmly greeted and brought into the fold because nervous people think, I don't want to make a mistake. The lawyer said it was all right. So I do think that'll actually, joking aside, be a good thing, particularly if certain people don't have close relationships. Because I've seen it in other councils where, the procurement view is, I don't want to involve the lawyers because they'll tell me what I can't do. Whereas if my experience is if you work really closely with the lawyers and they're part of the project, they'll help you get the outcome that you want. So I do think the new regs will probably be a bit of a reset on that in terms of relationships. And I think also once the service areas, the technical service areas, understand the importance of contract management and also about KPI reporting and the implications of that not going well, again, they will realise that they need to be involved in procurement and lawyers far more earlier. So putting aside the legislation, I think there'll be a lot of cultural, behavioural changes, which will be good things, in my opinion, from practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so if we covered kind of predominantly the legal side, Joe, if you were to engage technical stakeholders, customer stakeholders, whatever you want to call them, about the new regime and in particular the competitive flexible procedure, what would be the kind of the key things you would cover off with them? Because you don't want to bore them to death.
Oh, God. Well, I think we'd start with a pint in the pub, but
nice.
I think
that's all good meetings begin.
Yeah, I think so. There's a phrase that one of my clients has coined recently. And I quite like it. So, and I think it particularly applies to competitive flexible, which is all about a value statement. So we've said we've moved from meat to mat. How do you define advantageous? So what is valuable for you? And every organization will be different. Are you having quality problems? Are you having speed of delivery problems? Are you on an ESG carbon net zero? Are you driving social value, or are you purely driving cost? And there are probably a whole other areas. Once you've got your value statement, that kind of leads you onto a bit of a success criteria. You then want to make sure that your specification aligns with that, and then that your procedure and your technical questions tie back to that. So I can see there was a question in the chat around having KPIs on social value. When you're thinking about your value statement, if social value is really high on your value statement, then you want to make it important in your specification. You want to be testing it robustly in your evaluation model, and then you should have it on. Then, there is no reason why you should not have it on a KPI at the back end. So for me, it's about it's the art of picking out the key elements that are really important and are going to make or break the service or goods, and then trying to draw that golden thread through the process. And that will also help you design your process. So I've had quite a few conversations with people around what will a competitive flexible procedure look like. And I'm almost of the view it's not actually about value. I think it's about the criticality of the service for you. What's the risk of it going wrong? How and therefore how hard do you want to test the market? And it's also about how mature your requirements are. As Kevin said earlier, how much dialogue do you need to mature them? And how mature is the supply market for those requirements? I would love to see a world where negotiation is the norm. If you don't ask, you don't get. I think unless you're buying really simple goods that have got an SKU, low value, low risk, you should always run a quick and dirty round of negotiation. It's not high effort. It won't add time to your procedure, and it will just help sharpen all your bids. If that's the norm, you then sit there and have a discussion with your stakeholders, say, what more should we be doing? And actually, I think one of the best things for me coming out of the competitive flexible procedure, because you could probably do everything you wanted to under the old regs, is the training that Cabinet Office have released. And I talk about the Cabinet Office competitive flexible chessboard. Those of you who've done the training will know exactly what I mean, but it's all the different elements that sit there. And so if you think about it laterally, it's about, you've probably got some conditions of participation. You've possibly got an initial bid. Do you need to do validation? Do you want to do presentations, demos, and site visits because you're nervous about the supplier's bid? It's about evidence. Are you doing negotiation? Do you need a design phase? All of those kind of things. And now I think really at the forefront of everyone's mind, because Cabinet Office has said you should consider all these elements. So I think some things that were taboos previously, you can't do a presentation, actually I think we're starting to bring them back to the foreground.
Yeah, I think maybe that's quite a good way of framing it for technical stakeholders, right? Rather than like, oh, you've got to do this, we've got to do that. It's we get to do this. We've not been able to do this before. So come on, guys, get on board. If you get to a sneaker supplier visit out of it and a day out, why not? it's yeah, about reframing it. Yeah.
Can I chuck in the elephant in the room?
Depends what the elephant is, but go on.
Just to be a bit not controversial. One thing we haven't touched upon, which I think is really, really important, is supply side education.
Yeah.
So, as Joe mentioned, the Cabinet Office done a super job with the legislation. They've done a super job with the training and communities of practice, etc. I'm not so clear whether, and this isn't just a Cabinet Office role, by the way, this is a public procurer's role. Have we done enough supplier training, awareness, education to make the supply base bid ready? There's a lot of positives for SMEs and VCSEs with the legislation, I think, as we touched upon. But if you think about it, the suppliers who previously have said to me, oh, your procedures are so clunky and bureaucratic, that was the mantra. But actually, they knew exactly what was going to happen, when it was going to happen, and what was going to happen. And they understood the processes, and consequently, the bidding process was very predictable. If you imagine all of us now, we're going to do a complex procurement, we could all potentially do it in a different way with different stages and different steps and different evaluation methods and different levels of additional, supplementary activity. So the bidding process potentially for the supply base just got considerably more challenging, unpredictable, and may require new skills. So I do think one of the things that, I'm now back in, private sector procurement, but if I was still in public sector procurement as a head of, I will be doing significant amounts of supplier training, awareness, education to get them aware of what will follow. Now, I do think short term, it'll be a bit of an evolution of restricted competitive procedure with negotiation. It'll just happen to be called competitive flexible procedure. But in due course, when confidence is built and people can see the outcomes and evidence of what other people have done, it'll be more complex. So the supply side must not be forgotten about. So that's my elephant in the room.
No, it's a very fine elephant. You're allowed to have that elephant in the room. I will allow it.
I don't think it's an elephant, Darren. I think it is. We need to and we should do more. I understand the central position on it, because actually departments need to own those relationships locally, but don't be, you should be having those dialogues. I think you definitely should. I think what's really interesting, it does go down to a couple of fundamental skill sets. One is simple and clear procurement documents, outline what you're going to do and do it. And that, as long as you probably do that, you're going to keep Kevin happy. Say what you're going to do exactly what you said you're going to do, and people generally don't complain. I think the other bit that you've got to remember is suppliers far prefer a negotiated procedure with good quality feedback. If you have a robust, evidence-based negotiation with suppliers, where you give them feedback on both their technical and commercial scores, really highlight the difference, that is a value-add activity for the supplier. Yeah. And they will engage far better in that procedure. We obviously run procurements. We also bid in for them. And the worst procurements are the ones where you bid into them and you get a one-line answer saying you're unsuccessful. And you're like, great, I don't know what I did wrong. I don't know how far I was off the pace. I don't know which particular elements you liked or did not like. I might be unsuccessful. I don't gain anything from it. So actually engage, you need to engage your suppliers up front. If any of you haven't seen it, I think it's Network Rail have actually done a really good supplier engagement page on their website. It's not super detailed, but they've just put it out there. This is what we're going to be doing. I'd encourage all departments to do something similar. Say what you're going to do, but, have the dialogue with suppliers, have the negotiation. It will be a far better experience for all parties.
Yeah, I think
that's a good shout, Joe.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think so there's been some comments about whether or not there's kind of sufficient capacity within departments and in particular kind of local authorities to do all of these things. I think it's worth bearing in mind that, these things that get put out, they don't need to be especially sexy. They don't need to be a whole website. A one-pager doesn't take too long to put together and ping out to suppliers, even kind of speculatively. Darren, I don't know from your experience whether that's something that kind of resounds with you.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on a point Joe raised, actually, which is really valid. And now I'm no longer a local government procurement head. I can say that quite often the feedback I used to give to unsuccessful bidders was polite and courteous words that wouldn't get me in the dock. It wasn't necessarily value-added feedback to help the supplier improve, which is what actually you wanted to give. But, dare I say it, because of poor supplier behavior in certain industries where suppliers just challenge for the sake of challenge, it made procurement people nervous, and consequently relative characteristics and advantages of the winning bidder were just very courteous, polite words that were safe. I do think under the new procedures that we'll be able to give more helpful feedback that will, that will stimulate improvement. And back to the thing about resource, different industries and industry types have different levels of priority for procurement and the work that procurement is and what it does. And when I first went into local government, procurement wasn't really a prominent function. But if you actually look at it, I mean, from a council perspective, probably 55% what the council is and does is down to procurement. So question, why would you not resource that effectively?
Yeah.
When over 50% of what you deliver is based on how well you procure. And, I was very lucky in my career, particularly in the last stages, where we had very commercially astute chief executive and corporate directors. And, I managed to secure an appropriate resource to deliver, it was about £700 million worth of spend. And we had quite a sizable resource in the end compared to where we started. But there are still certain public sector organisations whose procurement functions are under-resourced.
Resourcing is
me,
one of the things we hear time and time again.
Yeah, that's a real, that's a real narrow view of life. So I would always encourage a right-sized procurement function, but I would say that, wouldn't I?
Yep. Thank you for sharing that, Darren. Really appreciate it. Time has absolutely flown. We've got a couple of minutes left. If that, I think what I would say, we've had so many questions through, far more questions than we'd anticipated. If you've shared a question and it's not been answered, please do leave your name if you submitted it anonymously, and we will respond to those after the fact. This recording will be shared in about 48 hours. So if you didn't enjoy it enough the first time, there's an opportunity to enjoy it even more the second time by watching it all again. And please note, this will go out to people that have registered and haven't been able to attend. I think that's all we've got time for today. I think it's fair to say we could keep going for another hour, but everyone's probably got lunch to get to. So we'll wrap that up there. And just a massive thank you to our fabulous panelists. So Kevin, Joe, Darren, you have been absolutely awesome. So much experience between you and some really, really good conversations. And finally, thank you to you all for joining. It's been great to have so much interaction. We've had a really, really good turnout. If you do want to know more about anything that Efficio are doing in the Procurement Act space, we have a suite of events and other things going on. So there is a negotiation training event in person in our London office on the 17th of October. If you'd like to register for that, please do reach out. You can find us on LinkedIn and email us as well. You can follow us on LinkedIn. There is a Procurement Act microcast that has just gone out with one of our colleagues, Andy Craig. That's absolutely fab and definitely worth listening to. Both of those are also on our public sector webpage. So if you go onto our Efficio website, you can navigate to the public sector page. You can find everything there. And also, if you haven't visited it already, I can really recommend the Mills and Reeve procurement portal, which has a very, very good 5 in 25 series countdown to the Procurement Act. If you're really keen, the next of those is tomorrow morning at 10 a.m, I do believe. So I think that's all for me. I've done my plug now, so I will wrap up. Thank you so much. And also big thanks to Abby Kramer, who puts a lot of hard work behind the scenes to organise these things. Look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.